Imagine a place of breathtaking beauty. Rolling Scottish hills dusted with mist, stags moving like ancient shadows across the heather, and the wind carrying a chill that smells of pine and rain. Yet for one of the most famous women in the world, it was not paradise. It was a place of watching eyes, of silence sharpened into judgment. Balmoral Castle, the royal refuge in the Highlands, has always been described as the family's sanctuary. For most, it meant escape. Fires crackling against cold stone, picnics by the River Dee, long walks that smelled of wet wool and whiskey. But for Diana, Princess of Wales, it was something else entirely. Beneath the laughter, she sensed the walls listening, every glance, every gesture measured, weighed, and quietly stored. The first time she arrived, newly engaged, she wanted to belong. The photographs still exist. A young woman in a red coat, standing beside the Queen, smiling with the obedience of hope. Yet behind that smile lived a trembling question. What if I am not one of them? At Balmoral, time moved differently. The family rose at dawn, rode horses through mist, lunched outdoors regardless of rain, and retired by strict schedule. Every fork had a place, every word a consequence. Diana learned quickly that silence at the breakfast table could wound more than any headline. The castle demanded stillness, not reverence, but submission. She later confided to friends that the air there felt heavier, that even the wind seemed to whisper correction. To the world, Balmoral was fairy tale Scotland. To her, it was a mirror of loneliness polished to perfection. In that vast, beautiful isolation, Diana discovered the quiet cruelty of expectation. Cameras may have been absent, but the scrutiny was not. In the dining hall, portraits of past monarchs watched her every move. She once said she felt as if she were walking through history that did not want her footprints. And yet, the tragedy of Balmoral is not that it was haunted, but that it made her hauntingly aware of herself. It was there that she first understood that within the monarchy's grand design, she was both jewel and prisoner, adored and invisible. Balmoral was meant to be refuge. For her, it became revelation, the beginning of the end disguised as a holiday in paradise. Balmoral stood like something carved from myth, granite walls rising against the highland fog, chimneys trailing ribbons of smoke into a sky that never quite decided between sun and rain. To the world, it was a fairy tale fortress. To those inside, it was a stage where every movement was ritual, every silence a line in a play that could never end. For generations, the royal family had come here to shed the weight of crowns and ceremony. Yet paradoxically, Balmoral was where the monarchy felt most itself, isolated, disciplined, enclosed. There were no paparazzi, no screaming crowds, only the hum of the River Dee and the faint echo of footsteps on stone. It was the kind of quiet that could cleanse or consume, depending on what you carried into it. For Diana, that quiet became unbearable. She arrived each summer with the same hesitant hope that perhaps this time she would be accepted, that the eyes around the dinner table would soften. But Balmoral was ruled by unspoken law. The Queen's schedule was sacred. Breakfast at 8, barbecues at 1, church at 11 on Sunday. Attendance was not invitation, it was obligation. The young princess found herself forever half a beat behind, her warmth mistaken for impulsiveness, her laughter for impropriety. Evenings were the worst. In the great drawing room, the clock ticked loud enough to feel like accusation. Conversation drifted toward the weather, the grouse, the estate's finances, safe topics, as cold as the stone they sat upon. Diana smiled, nodded, folded her hands, while inside she fought the rising tide of panic that came from being both visible and unseen. She tried to follow the family's outdoor rhythm, walking, fishing, riding. But even the beauty of the Highlands offered no relief. It was too still, she once said. Too perfect. Like the silence before an argument, you already know you'll lose. The landscape mirrored her isolation. Magnificent, remote, indifferent. At night, when the corridors emptied and the fires dimmed, she would slip to a window and stare into the black stretch of moorland. Somewhere beyond those hills, the world still breathed freely, yet here she could barely hear her own thoughts over the weight of decorum. The castle seemed alive, listening. She would later tell friends that even in sleep she felt watched, by portraits, by ghosts of queens who never had the choice to leave. In that silence, Balmoral taught her its cruelest lesson, that loneliness can echo louder than applause, and that the walls meant to protect her would one day bury her voice. Every royal residence has its rules, but Balmoral's were carved deeper than stone. There, form was faith and conformity the only virtue that mattered. Diana arrived believing that love might outweigh protocol. What she discovered instead was that in the House of Windsor, emotion had to dress in uniform. Days unfolded like choreography. Breakfast trays delivered by gloved hands, carriage rides scheduled to the minute, church services where even prayers seemed rehearsed. The castle moved with mechanical grace, its rhythm older than anyone living within it. Diana tried to keep pace, but her heart refused the tempo. She laughed too quickly, cried too easily, asked questions no one wanted to answer. It was not rebellion. It was sincerity, and sincerity is the one sin court life cannot forgive. In public, she performed flawlessly. The cameras loved her, the shy tilt of the head, the impossible compassion that turned strangers into believers. Yet behind those blue eyes flickered the panic of someone treading water. Balmoral magnified the tension between image and reality. Here, among the very people who should have known her best, she felt most foreign. Charles found solace in tradition, stalking through mist with his gun dogs, his silence another wall she could not breach. When she tried to talk of feeling unwell, he spoke of schedules, not solace. The Queen regarded her with polite patience, a monarch's kindness that neither warmed nor wounded. It simply endured. To them, emotion was weather, noticed, but never allowed to change the season. So Diana learned the art of invisibility. She smiled through dinners, rode in hunts she despised, posed in family photographs that would later be studied by millions searching for cracks in perfection. Those cracks were already there, tiny fissures beneath her careful poise. Friends recalled that after each Balmoral visit, she returned to London, thinner, paler, quieter. "It's beautiful," she would say, "but I can't breathe there." In her diary, she once called Balmoral the heart of the family machine. Machines are efficient. They are also cold. She wrote of feeling programmed, when to speak, when to eat, when to vanish. Her compassion, the very trait that made her beloved to the public, was treated inside those granite walls as fragility, not strength. The press would later romanticize Balmoral as the royal haven, a symbol of unity and heritage. Few realized that behind those windows, Diana's isolation became ritual. Each summer visit replayed the same performance, the same applause of silence. She understood that the monarchy did not destroy people. It polished them until their reflections disappeared. And so she perfected the mask, radiant, dutiful, adored. Yet every smile was a rebellion whispered through her eyes, every gesture a plea for humanity in a kingdom of marble. Balmoral demanded composure. Diana gave them grace instead, a grace that cost her peace. There is a particular stillness in the Highlands at dusk, a silence so complete it can feel like a confession. From the terrace of Balmoral, Diana would watch fog roll through the pines, veiling the mountains until even the horizon seemed to withdraw. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also a beauty that excluded her. The family she had married into spoke of the landscape as if it belonged to them by divine right. She saw it differently, as wilderness disguised as order. Inside the castle, shadows lengthened along corridors lined with portraits of stoic ancestors. Each face wore the same expression, endurance mistaken for serenity. In those silent witnesses, she recognized her future. The monarchy's history was written not in ink, but in restraint. For centuries, royal women had survived by saying nothing. Balmoral kept that tradition alive. When visitors arrived, the facade brightened. Barbecues by the River Dee, tartan blankets, laughter echoing off stone. But Diana noticed the choreography beneath it all. Who sat beside whom? Which stories were permitted? Which were avoided? Even in leisure, rank ruled. Her every movement was measured against an invisible standard. Every gesture quietly assessed. She once described it as living inside a glass cathedral where even your thoughts feel too loud. Her marriage had already begun to fracture, though the world did not yet see the cracks. At Balmoral, the distance between her and Charles grew into something visible only when they stood together. He found solace in solitude. She needed connection. The castle magnified that difference, turning silence into accusation. When she retreated to her room, she would write letters to friends, to her son's nannies, sometimes to herself. Words became her only rebellion, sentences scratched in slanted haste across thick stationery embossed with the royal crest. In one, she wrote simply, "I am so small here." Servants spoke later of hearing her walk the corridors at night, barefoot, her steps soft, as if afraid to wake the ghosts. And perhaps she did sense them, the echo of other women who had stood before those same windows, smiling for portraits that concealed despair. Balmoral was a sanctuary for the monarchy, but for Diana, it was a mausoleum for feeling. Outside, the highlands whispered indifference. Inside, the walls kept secrets too heavy to move. The Queen slept peacefully. Charles read until dawn. The princess counted the hours until escape. Years later, when she spoke openly of her unhappiness, she described Balmoral not with anger, but with sorrow. "It was magnificent," she said, "but it felt like the end of me." In those words lived the truth that the world had missed. The fairy tale had turned back into stone. There is a moment in every performance when the mask begins to crack. For Diana, that moment came not in public, but in the deceptive calm of Balmoral's mornings. The same routines that steadied everyone else began to suffocate her. The breakfast bell, the neat trays of silver, the endless courtesy. All reminders that in this place, emotion had to be hidden like contraband. She would rise early to walk before the household stirred. Mist clung to the lawns, softening the outlines of the hills. It was the only hour that belonged to her. Yet even then, she could feel the watchful presence of the estate. Keepers on patrol, gardeners waiting to appear the moment she turned. Privacy was an illusion, solitude, a rumor. Charles had grown distant, more at home among sketches and stalked deer than in the quiet of their shared rooms. His silences grew colder than argument. Diana, desperate to reach him, tried to please, adopting his hobbies, dressing as he preferred, smiling when she wanted to cry. But each attempt felt like a smaller version of herself. The harder she tried to fit, the more she disappeared. Those who served in the castle later spoke of her nervous energy, the restless pacing, the faint smell of perfume in hallways long after she'd passed. One footman recalled finding a tear-stained handkerchief tucked behind a chair after a family supper. "She always looked like she was apologizing for breathing," he said. By the early 1990s, Balmoral had turned from refuge to reminder. The marriage that had begun with televised grandeur now echoed with private absence. Each visit reopened old wounds. Even her beloved sons sensed the tension. The air that once carried laughter now carried restraint. Diana feared that what had trapped her might one day claim them too. The quiet inheritance of duty without joy. When the press began circling her life like vultures, Balmoral became both shield and cage. Behind its gates, she was safe from cameras but not from memory. Each stone seemed to whisper her failures back to her. Each portrait an accusation she couldn't refute. Friends urged her to skip the royal summer gatherings. She rarely dared. The monarchy's gravity was impossible to resist. It pulled her back every time. Yet inside, something had shifted. The girl who once sought approval now wanted freedom, whatever its cost. On her final visits, staff noticed she spent long hours by the loch, sketching, writing, staring at the mountains that never moved. "I wonder," she murmured once, "if they can hear us or if they've stopped listening." It was there, beneath Scotland's cold serenity, that Diana understood the truth she could no longer ignore. To survive, she would have to leave the place that had taught her what fear really meant. Leaving Balmoral was never as simple as driving away. The castle clung to her, its silence following her like a second shadow. Even in London, among crowds and cameras, she could feel the echo of those Highland mornings, the damp air, the distant bells of the estate chapel, the knowledge that every word she spoke had been judged before it was spoken. By the mid-1990s, that silence had hardened into defiance. Diana began to reclaim her voice in small, careful ways. A glance unapproved, a sentence unedited, a gesture that belonged to no protocol. To the public, these seemed trivial. Inside the palace, they were earthquakes. The same woman once accused of fragility, now frightened an institution built on endurance. Interviews, charity work, hospital visits, each appearance became a language of rebellion. She spoke openly about mental health, about isolation, about the human cost of duty. The monarchy maintained its silence, mistaking restraint for strength. But outside those walls, her honesty resonated louder than royal ceremony. People saw in her the courage to name what others only endured. And yet, Balmoral's shadow remained. Each summer when the family retreated north, she would feel the familiar dread return. "It's the stillness," she said once. "It remembers too much." The castle had become the symbol of everything she could not mend: her marriage, her image, her peace. She refused the invitations more often, choosing instead to stay in London, where noise at least felt alive. Freedom came not as triumph, but as exile. When her separation from Charles became official, Balmoral closed to her entirely. The press framed it as scandal. She felt it as breath. The place that had once silenced her now lost its power, yet its memory lingered like frost that never melted. In interviews after her divorce, she spoke with remarkable calm about the monarchy. There was no bitterness, only truth. "I wanted to be their heartbeat," she said softly, "but I was never part of their body." Those words carried the ache of Balmoral, the lesson that compassion could not survive where empathy was protocol. Outside Britain, her compassion became legend. Crowds followed her not because she was royal, but because she was human. Yet the irony endured. The woman who found her voice had to lose her home to do it. The last time she saw Balmoral, she did not enter. Passing by on a helicopter, she looked down at the estate, its grey walls glowing under Scottish sun, the same landscape that had once caged her, and said nothing. Perhaps that silence was her final victory, the silence she chose, not the one forced upon her. For the first time, Balmoral's stillness belonged to her. History remembers palaces for their grandeur, but sometimes the real story lives in what those walls could not contain. Balmoral still stands, untouched by time, its granite walls reflecting Scottish reign and royal ritual. Yet somewhere within its stillness, a memory lingers, a whisper of the woman who looked out through its windows and saw not tradition, but a prison with perfect views. When Diana died in 1997, the news reached Balmoral first. It was early morning. The castle's corridors filled with hurried footsteps and disbelief. Outside, the highlands remained unchanged, mist on the hills, deer crossing the River Dee. But something in the air shifted. The sanctuary that had silenced her was now haunted by her absence. Those who were there later recalled the unbearable quiet. Bells were not rung, curtains were drawn, and the Queen, stoic as stone, ordered the family to stay, away from the glare of London. The world outside demanded emotion. Balmoral demanded composure. Once again, silence ruled. But this time, the silence was broken from beyond. Outside the castle gates, flowers began to appear, spreading across Britain like color, reclaiming a grayscale world. Millions gathered, grieving a stranger as though she were kin. The people's voice rose louder than any royal decree, and for the first time in generations, the monarchy had to listen. The woman they could not understand in life had become the conscience they could not ignore in death. When the queen finally emerged to address the nation, her words trembled not with weakness, but with recognition. The monarchy had learned what Diana had always known, that love, when withheld, turns to fear, and fear left unspoken becomes tragedy. Today, tourists walk the halls of Balmoral, admiring portraits and antique furnishings. Guides speak of heritage, of lineage, of royal summers filled with laughter. Few mention the young princess who found only loneliness among the mountains. Yet sometimes, when rain taps against the windows, one might feel the atmosphere shift, a hush that feels less like reverence and more like remembrance. Diana's fear of Balmoral was never truly about the castle. It was about the weight of perfection, the cost of belonging to a family that could not forgive humanity. In her courage to speak, she gave that humanity back to the crown, even as it cost her peace. Her legacy endures not in marble or title, but in empathy, the ability to see fragility as strength. Where Balmoral once stood as fortress, it now stands as mirror, reflecting the truth that silence, however royal, can no longer rule. If this story stayed with you tonight, let it linger. Leave a thought for the woman who taught the world that even in fear, grace can rebel, and that sometimes freedom begins the moment you stop whispering.